Welcome back to the Foundation in C# course. We're currently in Module 9, and this lesson we're going to be setting up the bookings search. I think you'll find this is actually pretty easy to do, especially after the previous two. So let's look at the homework. Add a method that searches the bookings for a set of entries. So it's going to find if we're going to search for the last name and today's date, and it's going to find all the records for that last name and today's date. Okay, that's all it's going to do. So go ahead and get that done in your application and then come back and unpause this video. So pause the video right now and do that. All right, so I assume you are done. So let's go ahead and go over to our Visual Studio and SQL data. And we'll come down here. We're going to collapse these methods. There's no reason to have them open. And after this last method, doesn't matter where you put it, before or after, doesn't matter. We're going to say public void, and this is going to be search bookings. And we do know we need to pass in a last name. Now, return type, we don't have a bookings model yet, but that's what we need. We need to have a list of bookings. But it's not just the bookings, it's who booked it. So let's start by building that query. So we're going to come over here and create a new query. And let's add some empty lines. And we're going to say select star from dbo.bookings, call it alias of B. And we're going to run this. And this gives us all of our bookings. Now, let's do a join, so an inner join on dbo.guests g, where b.guestid equals g.id. Now we're going to say b.star g.star. If we run this, it says, no, you got a problem here. And it's not where, it's on. Think, Tim. All right, so now we have for every room that we have a booking for. Notice this room has two bookings for the same person. And one is the executive suite, one is a 2 queen beds. So it looks like probably I've booked it for somebody else. But Tim Corey, okay? Now this is duplicated, but not really, because there's only one guest per room. And since we have an entry for every room, we're not actually duplicating our entries. So now let's do this. Let's get back just the data we need. For example, do we need the room ID? Well, we actually kind of do. And we probably also need the room information about what room number it is. So let's join on that too. So inner join, we're actually adding, not removing, dbo.rooms, and we'll call this R on, and it's going to be b.roomid equals r.id. Now we can say r.star. And if we run this, now we have, okay, that's room 301 and that's room 201. Those are the bookings we have. And there's the room type ID. Which, do we need those room types too? Well, yeah, probably. Because we'll need to be able to display that to user and say, oh, you booked the executive suite and you booked the 2 queen bedroom. So, inner join dbo.room types on, oops, let's call RT on B dot, actually no, R dot room type ID equals RT dot ID. And let's change this rooms up here to a capital R. And now up here we can say RT dot star. And we run this again, and now we have this one's the executive suite, and that's the 2 queen beds. Oh, there's the descriptions for each, and there is the price for each room per night. We also have over here the total cost. That's a lot of information. Let's break down just what we need by group, okay? Because we have ID here, we have ID here, we have ID here, and that's confusing. In fact, we have one more ID, I think it's right here. So let's not do that. Let's keep the room ID, the guest ID, and then we'll also have to have the room type ID. But we'll lose all the other IDs, okay? So let's expand the wildcards, which we have to do manually. Ugh, hate that. Let's do this in a store procedure then, because that'll make our life a little easier. So add store procedure, SP bookings, search. And we're going to have no parameters. No, last name and varchar 50. Oh, and date too. And the date is going to be the start date. Okay? And we're going to say begin and end and set no count on. And we'll paste in our query. I'm not quite ready to be done with this query yet, but I wanted to have this refactoring to expand wildcards. Notice it's going to expand all of them if I want to, and I do. I hit OK. And now I'm going to say the ID is fine, and all the B's are fine. Let's tab this in. One tab is fine. But over here I have g.id. Don't want that, because I already have the guest ID right here. So now I have r.id. Don't want that because I already have the room ID right there. So now I have room type ID. Cool. But I don't need the room type ID again. So let's get rid of that. And now I should have, let's get rid of, no, we're going to leave the price alone. We'll just know that's the price per night versus the total cost. Okay, but here's all the fields we're going to have, and I think that's a valid list. But we do want to limit it, so we're going to say where, and we're going to set the start date. So b.startDate equals start date. All right, so it's going to limit our list and say only the start dates that match a given date. So let's copy this back to our query. And I'll overwrite my query with this, but instead of start date, I'm just going to put the actual value. So this start date here is 12/5. So if we checked in or try to check in 12/4/19, we should get no records, because there's nobody here on that date. There's no check-in available. But 12/5, if we run that, we get 2 records. Now we also need to filter it by last name. So let's do that as well. And oops, I'm sorry, not B. It is G.lastName equals last name. That's going to filter it by the last name as well. So only give us the bookings for a person's last name on the particular date when we're asking for. In this case, we're always going to ask for today's date. So that's our query. Now let's create, oops, I hit save all. We don't want to save this query. We just want to save our store procedure and our SQL data access. We'll save that as well. But let's create a model now for our bookings. So let's create a class, and we'll call this, let's call this full booking, or booking full model. All right. That way, if we have just a model that's closely tied to one row in that bookings table, we don't need to have all this extra stuff. But for the full model, we're going to need to have more information. Now let's open a new horizontal document group so we can see what we have up here, and we'll create the properties down here to match. So we're going to say ID, room ID, so this would be an int room ID, a guest ID, a date time of start date, a date time of end date. Checked in is actually a bool. Now remember that in SQL it's actually a bit, a 0 or 1, but that can translate over to a Boolean in C#. A decimal for total cost, a string for first name, a string for last name, get the casing right, a string for room number, an int for room type ID, a string for title, a string for description, and a decimal for price. So there it matches up a model that matches exactly the fields we'll return from our query. Now, notice this query does not return just for do if you need to rename some of these things. Okay, so we have our store procedure, sp bookings underscore search. We're going to pass in a last name and a start date. We have a last name here. Let's do a db.load data. This is of type bookings full model. And oops, we pass in dynamic as well. We need to pass in our store procedure name, which is dbo dot. So let's fix that. And then we need to pass in our parameters. So new empty object, our connection string name, and true, we are using a stored procedure. Let's right click and refactor this to wrap every argument, and we'll match up how we normally wrap it. And let's pass in our variables, our parameters. So we need two. We need last name, which we have, and we also need the date, and that was called the start date. Okay, so start date equals, and what is a start date? Well, it's date time dot now dot date. That's today's date, just the date portion, not the date and time. This .date is very important. Otherwise, you'll get now at a certain time, and that's not a great idea. All right, what is this going to return? Well, this is going to return a list of full booking model, which that's what we're going to return from the search booking. So list of booking full model. And so we're going to say, let's just say var output equals, and then, actually we didn't say return. Don't need to have a variable. Return that. Now up here, I believe we do, nope, we just do return. If you have a debugging issue where you're not sure what's going on, you might want to break this into 2 lines. So var output equals, and then return output. That way you can put a breakpoint on the return output and inspect the output to see if the values are correct at this stage, or if it's the next stage that's having a problem, or where it is. All right. So but this I think works just fine. So search bookings. That's all we have to do for searching the bookings. Okay. Hopefully you understood that, and hopefully you tracked with that and got the same thing when you were doing it. Now let's move on to the next lesson where we have the ability for the user to check in to say that they're here.